They yanked his bag, dumped it on the floor, and watched his papers scatter like trash beneath polished shoes. No apology, no explanation. Just eyes that said he didn't belong. He was the only black man in the room, and that was all it took. Suits turned away. Security moved in. A velvet rope became a wall. What was supposed to be a simple banking visit turned into a public shaming dressed as procedure, carried out with cold smiles and clipped tones. They saw his skin, not his worth. They assumed silence. But what they mistook for weakness was the start of something they couldn't control. Stick around, hit like, subscribe, and tell us, where are you watching from? And what would you have done in his place? Drop your thoughts below. This isn't just one man's story. This is the moment the system met its match. Langston Merriweather, wearing a threadbare brown suit and scuffed brogues, approached the velvet rope VIP entrance at Eastward National Bank. He waited patiently, shoulders straight, a satchel in one hand. The concierge scanned him with a slow, deliberate glance, then leaned toward security without a word. Moments later, two guards approached. One took the satchel, emptied it onto the pavement without permission. Papers spilled, caught in the wind, some trampled by hurried heels. Langston was shoved backward. His lip bled, his cuff split. No apology was offered. Inside the marble lobby, a boy in a miniature uniform tugged his father's sleeve and pointed toward the window. The father, smiling, sipping espresso, watched Langston hit the ground, then calmly turned his chair away. The cold from the concrete seeped through Langston's slacks as he sat back on the pavement, stunned. He could feel the sting on his cheek where his face had brushed the sidewalk, and the slow trickle of blood from the split in his lip. He hadn't seen it coming. Not really, not like this. One moment, he was waiting in line for his scheduled meeting with one of the bank's senior financial advisors. The next, his documents were fluttering through air like confetti, his breath shallow, his dignity splayed across the ground. The guards had already turned their backs, brushing off their jackets, like he was dirt they'd shaken off. No explanation had been offered, no request to speak, no voice at all, just quiet decisions made in private gestures and followed with public consequence. Langston pulled himself to his feet slowly, not bothering to wipe the dust from his slacks, and crouched to retrieve the papers. His knees popped from the cold and age, but he moved carefully, as though each paper held a secret they had tried to tear from him. Balance sheets, market forecasts, community integration plans, notes he'd handwritten last night, outlining the future he hoped to present today. One was stamped with a heel print. Another carried a streak of shoe polish. Each page he returned to his folder felt heavier than the last. A gust of wind caught one loose sheet and sent it dancing down the sidewalk. He limped after it, catching it against the curb before it disappeared into the gutter. The bench across from the entrance looked unused, but Langston hesitated before lowering himself onto it. His hand was shaking, not from pain, but from restraint. He placed the folder beside him and removed a handkerchief from his coat, pressing it to his lip, tasting blood. He sat in silence, watching the front doors of Eastward open and close like a mouth that only spoke to certain people. A man in a camel coat walked in without showing ID, clapping a guard on the shoulder as he passed. A woman in a crimson scarf followed behind him, laughing into her phone, the concierge greeting her by name. Langston had prepared for this meeting for weeks. He had revised his deck, rehearsed his pitch, combed over regulatory filings to anticipate every objection. His software was ready to scale. The first group of beta testers had shown positive retention. He had booked this appointment with a financial partner after 6 months of trying. He had even polished his shoes the night before and worn the suit his mother had tailored for him after he landed his first client. But none of that mattered. Not when the concierge leaned in to whisper. Not when the guards appeared. Not when his seat at the table evaporated without a word. He sat with his hands on his knees, fingers twitching slightly, the city moving around him. Somewhere, a cab honked. A bus hissed into a stop. Pigeons scratched at crumbs under a newsstand. The world went on, and Langston Merriweather sat beneath the towering facade of Eastward National Bank with his lips split open and his dreams bent beneath the heel of someone else's indifference. A woman passed by with a stroller, glanced at him, then looked away quickly, as though she'd seen something she wished she could unsee. A man in athletic wear jogged past without noticing. A valet retrieved keys from a luxury sedan and nodded toward the building. Langston wasn't invisible. He was worse. He was acknowledged, then dismissed, labeled, flagged, forgotten. He reached down and lifted the folder back into his lap. He flipped it open. Pages bent, edges creased. It wasn't ruined, not completely. The data was intact. The plan was sound. The vision hadn't changed, only the room he thought he'd enter. He stared at the top page. The bridge model, Financial Solutions for Underserved Growth. That was the title. That was the hope. Bringing financial empowerment to the ignored. Irony now curled in the corners of every word. But Langston didn't crumple the page. He didn't toss the folder. He didn't let the damage win. A Blacktown car pulled up to the curb, and a man in his 50s stepped out, salt and pepper hair slicked back, his navy wool coat hanging effortlessly on his frame. Langston recognized him. Richard Belhust, Regional VP. He was the kind of man who appeared in Forbes profiles and local charity boards, whose handshake carried stock shifts. Langston had requested this meeting through 6 layers of gatekeeping. Richard walked inside without a glance. His assistant trailed behind, holding an iPad and coffee, not noticing the man on the bench. Langston leaned back and closed his eyes for a moment. He thought about his grandfather, who had worked for decades cleaning floors in buildings just like this one. He thought about his father, who had been denied a loan 3 times before starting his barbershop out of a garage. He thought about his mother, who had taught him how to hold his head high while people looked down. He thought about the day he decided to enter finance, not for wealth, but for change, for access, for equity. That dream wasn't dead, but it was bruised, badly. He sat there for nearly an hour, not moving, not calling anyone, just watching, just remembering, letting the moment burn into him until it stopped being a wound and became something else, a promise. Eventually, he stood. He buttoned his coat. He adjusted the strap on his satchel. Then he walked away from the bank and into the crowd, not with defeat, but with a quiet, dangerous kind of focus. He had been thrown out today, not just from a building, but from the illusion that merit alone was enough, that playing by the rules guaranteed a seat. He knew better now, and he would act accordingly. He didn't know when. He didn't know how. But one day, Eastward would remember the man in the brown suit they tried to erase. And they'd learn that sometimes the ones you ignore are the ones you should fear most. The same security guards were posted near the entrance, but they didn't so much as glance in his direction. He passed through the automated door like a ghost returned from an earlier life. This time, he didn't approach the executive entrance. He knew better. He walked instead toward the main counter, where 4 tellers stood behind bulletproof glass and digital kiosks blinked with stock market updates. Langston waited in line. His coat was clean, the satchel zipped tight and held closer to his chest. He kept his eyes forward, posture straight, and mind focused. He had called ahead, spoken with a junior associate named Evan, confirmed a brief meeting slot with the investment team. No one had mentioned the morning incident. Perhaps they didn't know. Perhaps they did. It didn't matter now. He had returned, and this time he would not be erased so easily. When his turn came, he stepped up to the counter and presented his card. The teller, a young woman with a name tag that read Kelly, looked at it, then looked at him, and for a second her smile faltered. Just a flicker. Her eyes flicked to the side, and then she cleared her throat and said she'd be right back. She walked away, leaving Langston standing at the window, his card on the counter between them. Behind him, the line shifted uncomfortably. No one said anything, but he could feel the weight of impatience coiling behind his back. When Kelly returned, she was not alone. A man in a gray vest and wire-rimmed glasses walked beside her, holding a tablet and nodding politely. He introduced himself as Mr. Deaton, a mid-tier manager in client services. Langston extended a hand. Deaton didn't take it. Instead, he gestured slightly to the side, directing Langston toward a waiting area lined with leather chairs and artificial succulents. They sat down. Deaton smiled the way someone smiles at a client they don't want but can't legally dismiss. Langston explained again who he was, the nature of his business, the meeting he had scheduled. Deaton listened with the patience of a man already rehearsing a response. When Langston finished, Deaton leaned back slightly and said that, unfortunately, there had been a systems error. The meeting no longer appeared on the calendar. The associate he had spoken with, Evan, had been reassigned to another department. Perhaps Langston could resubmit his request through the proper channels. It would, of course, be reviewed. Langston asked if someone from investment services could be reached. Deaton apologized. They were unavailable. Meetings were full for the next 2 weeks. Maybe 3. He suggested Langston check back later. Langston's voice remained calm, but inside, frustration simmered like acid on steel. He had followed every step, checked every box. And now again he was being guided politely toward a door labeled later, which in places like this often meant never. He left the chair quietly, gathered his things, and walked toward the exit without another word. Behind him, Deaton was already typing on his tablet, likely noting something about his demeanor, a subtle comment that would follow Langston's name in the database like a shadow. As he crossed the lobby, his eye caught movement in a glass-walled office near the escalator. Inside, 2 men and a woman sat reviewing portfolios on dual-monitor displays. One of the men laughed and pointed at a chart. The woman tapped a stylus against her tablet, eyes locked on a screen. On the wall behind them, a poster declared, "Eastward innovates for the future." Langston turned away. Downstairs, in the operations wing, a young intern named Jace stood beside a paper shredder. He held a file folder with Langston Merriweather's name on it. It had been marked with a red sticker, flagged high sensitivity. He had been instructed to dispose of it immediately. He didn't know why. He didn't ask. His supervisor had handed it over during lunch break and said to be discreet. Jace fed the pages in slowly, one by one, watching ink disappear into curling strips. Financial statements, a client proposal, a digital copy of an email exchange, all of it gone. When the final sheet disappeared, he closed the lid, emptied the bin into a locked bag, and marked the task as complete in the internal system. Meanwhile, Langston exited the bank into the chill of late afternoon. He stood on the curb, staring down the avenue where city buses hissed and traffic crept forward like molasses. His reflection glared back at him from the polished window. The man he saw looked tired, not just physically, but in that deeper, cellular way that comes from repeated disappointment. He thought of calling someone, maybe Marcus, his legal advisor, or Terrell, his co-founder, but he didn't. He knew how that conversation would go. They would be angry, yes, but they would also be unsurprised. Langston had dared to assume that systems built to exclude would suddenly make space because he had credentials. He had dared to believe that logic and preparation would cut through bias and protocol. He had forgotten momentarily that erasure didn't always come with sirens. Sometimes it arrived wearing a polite smile and offering a seat in the lobby. He turned and began walking. The sidewalk was crowded now, filled with people leaving work, phones in hand, conversations rising in volume. Langston walked among them unnoticed. At a red light, he paused. The folder in his satchel still held the core proposal, his backup copy unshredded. The numbers were solid. The data was real. What had changed was not the merit of his work, but the willingness of those in power to see it. And when they refused to see, they erased. Politely, efficiently, without breaking a single rule. He arrived at a small cafe 2 blocks away and took a seat near the window. He ordered a black coffee, no sugar. The barista didn't look twice at him. That, at least, was a relief. He pulled out his tablet and reopened the documents. He needed to regroup, find another path. Maybe a smaller investment group. Maybe the FinTech Summit next quarter. He would have to change strategy, not compromise the mission, but reshape the approach. He had seen behind the curtain now. There was no use pretending the system wasn't rigged. He would need to play differently, smarter, with sharper edges. Across the street, Eastward National's logo glinted on the glass. its letters bold and sharp against the setting sun. He stared at it without blinking. Then he lowered his gaze, returned to the data, and began making notes. His fingers moved with purpose. In the days that followed, Langston Merriweather did not rest. He rose each morning with precision, his movements deliberate, each gesture fueled by the silent resolve that had crystallized beneath the humiliation he had endured. The erasure had not just bruised his pride, it had gouged a deep, unhealing line across the narrative he had spent years constructing. He had believed that building himself up from nothing, crafting a product with tangible worth, and presenting it with poise would be enough. But Eastwood National had answered his preparation with silence, and had stamped his ambition with a quiet, smiling no. It wasn't just rejection. It was displacement. His file shredded. His presence flagged. His potential ignored. But what they didn't erase was his clarity. Langston knew what had happened wasn't a mistake. It was a message wrapped in procedure. Now it was his turn to reply. He chose to observe before making his next move. On a Wednesday afternoon, he returned to Eastwood's flagship branch, not to speak, not to request anything, but simply to watch. He wore a coat longer than the one from before, one that draped past his knees and concealed the finer suit beneath it. His shoes were polished, his satchel replaced with a sleek document folio. He crossed the lobby without stopping, moving past the teller lines and toward the elevated mezzanine where Eastwood's first-class banking lounge was tucked behind smoked glass and soft lighting. He didn't attempt to enter. He simply stood near the railing, surveying the subtle mechanics of the place. It was an unspoken world, choreographed like a dance. There were no raised voices, no sudden gestures, only the fluid exchange of nods and quiet entitlements. Langston saw it in the way a white man in a navy overcoat approached the guards at the rope line. No ID, no ticket. The guards nodded him through. They knew him, or he looked like someone they were supposed to know. A woman followed close behind, her laughter trailing as she greeted the concierge by name. Langston watched as another man stepped to the front of the line, glancing at his phone. The guard waved him in without a second thought. Langston could feel the code pulsing through the space. It wasn't written anywhere, but it was obeyed absolutely. Appear like you belong, and you are welcomed. Appear like Langston had that morning, and you are removed. A subtle scene unfolded then, one that twisted something inside him. A maintenance worker stepped into view, pushing a small wheeled cart with bottles of polish and stacks of paper towels. He was middle-aged, brown-skinned, thin. His eyes flicked upward briefly as he passed near the lounge entrance. One of the guards turned, issued a sharp nod, and the worker turned immediately into a side hallway, away from the main floor. Nothing was said aloud. Langston watched the exchange and felt the bitter sting of familiarity. Not just rejection, repositioning, as if the space was allergic to his kind unless they were polishing its surfaces. Langston approached the velvet rope that cordoned off the lounge entrance, pretending to glance at the digital directory on the nearby pillar. From here, he could see the gleaming interior, brass fixtures, dark wood, ambient lighting that cast everything in a golden hue. Inside, a man in his early 40s held court at the corner bar, laughing loudly. His voice echoed off the glass. His blazer was crisp, expensive, and unnecessary in its precision. One of the security guards leaned toward his colleague and murmured something with a smirk, eyes flicking toward Langston for a heartbeat before returning to the lounge. Langston stepped away, making a slow circuit of the mezzanine. His eyes opened now not just to the structure, but the spectacle. A performance was being staged here every day. It wasn't overt. It didn't require a script, but it was no less deliberate. The space spoke in silent declarations. This is who we serve. This is who belongs. He passed a promotional display near the private banking offices, photos of smiling families, all light-skinned, standing in front of lake houses and golf courses, their grins wide beneath text that read, "For generations, we've protected what matters most." Langston stared at the ad for a long moment. Generations. Yes, that was the word. A closed loop, a lock stage. And he was not part of the cast. He descended to the lower level again, back to the main floor and moved near the teller kiosks. This time, he did something different. He took a spot at the back of the client line, not to engage, but to observe further. A few minutes later, he saw a man approach the teller beside him. The man was white, younger, wearing a wool beanie and cargo pants. He looked vaguely lost. No appointment, no suit. The teller greeted him with warmth, chatted easily, and directed him to a personal banker upstairs. Langston's own last attempt, by contrast, had been met with delays, cold smiles, and ultimately disappearance. The contrast wasn't just visible, it was blinding. Langston left the line and headed toward the service desk near the business account section. He stood to the side again, watching. A slender woman in a navy skirt suit stepped forward, pulling up a digital client profile. She glanced over her shoulder and waved to a man behind her, a senior advisor, judging by the gold badge clipped to his lapel. The man approached. Langston recognized him. It was the same banker he had hoped to meet weeks ago. He was laughing, his arm around the shoulders of a man in golf attire. The two walked into a side room, the door closing behind them with the soft hush of soundproofing. As Langston turned to leave, one of the custodial staff, the same worker he'd seen redirected earlier, accidentally spilled a bottle of cleaning polish just ahead of him. The bottle struck the floor with a soft thunk and rolled against Langston's shoe. The man apologized quickly, reaching down to grab it. Langston bent down at the same time, handed it back with a nod. The man gave a grateful smile and returned to his cart. But before he could move on, a security guard approached, eyes narrowing. He pointed toward Langston and said in a voice just loud enough for nearby patrons to hear, "We're going to need to keep this area clear. Let's not make a mess here." Langston blinked, barely believing what he was hearing. The guard had seen a brief act of kindness and turned it into a suggestion of disorder. The implication wasn't subtle. Langston's presence, even in help, had been registered as disruption. He straightened, fixed the guard with a long look, but said nothing. Words would only be twisted. He turned and walked away, the quiet of the building growing louder with each step. Outside, the sky had darkened into a steel gray, the city lights flickering to life one by one. He walked slowly, thoughts reeling with the weight of the performance he had witnessed. They hadn't needed to say anything cruel. They hadn't needed to push this time. The morning after the silent rejection he had witnessed at Eastwood National's lounge, Langston Merriweather sat at his apartment desk, staring at the glowing screen of his laptop, rereading the confirmation email he had received after completing the online pre-registration form for Eastwood's new small business account application. His cursor hovered over the Schedule in-person appointment button. He had already been erased once. He had already been denied through silence, ignored by ritual, displaced by unspoken codes. But he wasn't done. His company needed an account, one that would allow them to begin onboarding clients. Waiting was no longer a luxury. With his shoulders set and jaw firm, Langston booked the appointment. This time, he'd enter through the front door of the Small Business Services Department, not as a pitchman or a visitor, but as a prospective customer. They couldn't pretend he wasn't real if he walked in holding proof that they had welcomed him. That was the plan, anyway. He arrived early, dressed carefully in a charcoal suit with a navy tie, his beard trimmed to perfection, shoes shined to a mirror finish. As he stepped into the bank's business wing, a separate entrance from the VIP lounge he had been ejected from before, he noticed the difference in tone immediately. There was less marble, fewer chandeliers. The walls were lined with framed certificates, not art. The lighting was sterile, the furniture purely functional. A woman behind the glass reception window looked up as he approached. She checked his name, nodded, and buzzed him in. So far, so normal. She pointed him toward a side office with frosted glass panels and a door labeled Advisor 2A. Wallace. Inside the office, the air was quiet and cool. A banker named Ava Wallace stood to greet him, her smile efficient and professional, her blouse pressed into crisp lines. She offered him a seat and asked how she could help. Langston launched into his explanation, handing over a folder containing the necessary paperwork. business registration, tax identification, bank references, and cash flow statements. She listened politely, nodding at the right beats, occasionally typing something into her system. Langston felt a cautious optimism bloom in his chest. This, finally, was progress. This was what normal looked like. Ava's eyes narrowed slightly as she stared at her screen. Langston watched her expression closely. The warm engagement she'd offered began to thin, replaced by a subtle tightness around her mouth. She clicked once, twice. Her cursor moved, then froze. A red box blinked briefly in the corner of her screen before disappearing. Langston noticed it. Ava noticed that he noticed. Her smile returned, but it was thinner now, forced. "I'm going to check something real quick," she said lightly, rising from her chair. "Won't be long." Langston nodded, already knowing she wouldn't return. She exited the office with a casualness that seemed practiced. Langston sat in silence, hands folded neatly in his lap, the air suddenly feeling stale. He waited. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Outside the frosted glass, the occasional figure walked past, none looking in. A delivery cart rolled by once, then nothing. At 20 minutes, Langston stood, stretched his legs, then sat again. At 30, he stepped out into the hallway. Down the corridor, just outside an IT closet left partially ajar, a digital service board blinked with client status updates. Langston's name appeared on the list, highlighted in yellow. Beside it, a flashing symbol, triangular, red. The kind of icon usually reserved for flagged accounts or internal alerts. He froze. Before he could move closer, 2 bank employees turned the corner. One noticed the screen, paled, and quickly tapped her colleague's arm. They rushed forward, shielding the display with their bodies. One whispered into a headset. The other began unplugging the board. Langston remained where he stood, hands at his sides. They didn't look at him. They didn't explain. They acted like he wasn't there. He returned to the office, collected his documents, and left the bank without a word. Outside, the sun had risen higher, but the light felt thin and insincere. On the walk back to his car, Langston thought not about the lost time or the abandoned appointment, but about that symbol, the flashing red triangle. He thought about the vanishing notes on Ava's screen, the forced politeness in her smile, and the way she left without looking back. The system had marked him. Somewhere in Eastward's digital vaults, a tag had been attached to his name. He wasn't a client. He was a caution. Later that day, he opened a burner laptop he used for testing security protocols. He typed his own name into a private analytics scraper he'd built for tracking institutional records. The system returned no new flags in public data, no new bankruptcies, no negative press, no alerts, which meant whatever label had been applied to him lived inside Eastward's walls, and nowhere else. Internal only. He was being buried in quiet. Langston stood in his kitchen that evening, staring at his reflection in the microwave door as it counted down seconds on a reheated plate of untouched food. His mind raced not with outrage, but with cold, methodical understanding. He wasn't just dealing with a few bad actors. This wasn't a personal slight. It was a process, an internal mechanism that recognized threats not by action, but by presence. They saw him, and they didn't like what they saw, so they tagged, erased, and silenced. The next morning, he returned, not to the front door this time, but to the sidewalk across the street. He watched employees arrive, coffee in hand, badges clipped to lapels. He recognized Ava Wallace, her posture tighter now, her eyes darting once in his direction before she disappeared inside. He saw one of the men from the hallway, the one who unplugged the board. He walked with another employee, laughing easily. None of them saw Langston, not really. They saw what they thought they'd removed. He had received the invitation a month prior, before the incident at the rope, before the office visit that ended in silence, before the appointment that evaporated with a red warning triangle. Someone in the outreach department had likely added his name before his file was flagged. That detail didn't matter now. The gala was a private function, an annual celebration for high-value clients, regional stakeholders, and prospective partners. It was not open to the public. The invitation came printed on fine linen stock with gold foil along the corners and embossed letters spelling his name with sterile formality. He had debated attending, but not long. There was a difference between retreating and observing, and tonight Langston would observe. He didn't walk into that evening expecting to be welcomed, but he had not prepared himself for how far the institution would go to remind him of his place. The building shimmered in warm amber light, with sleek black cars unloading guests beneath a temporary overhang dusted with fresh snow. Valets rushed like actors in a well-rehearsed play, coats whisked from shoulders, doors held with gloved precision. Langston stepped out of a cab 3 cars back, tucking the invitation under his arm as he adjusted the collar of his coat. His shoes crunched over salted pavement as he moved toward the entrance. He felt the first eyes on him before he reached the registration line. A man in a dark suit tilted his head slightly, scanning Langston without curiosity, only with that bureaucratic calculation he had come to recognize. He was being weighed, measured, filed away into a conclusion already written. At the glass doors, a young woman with glossy lipstick and an earpiece greeted guests with an enthusiastic smile. Langston presented his invitation. She took it with one hand, tapped it into her tablet with the other, and paused. Her eyes narrowed. She tried again. Langston waited, expression unreadable, hands folded in front of him. The woman turned to a man behind her, older, wearing a staff badge clipped to his jacket pocket. He looked at the screen and whispered something too low for Langston to hear. The younger woman returned her attention to Langston. Her smile was still there, but it had lost its shape. "Would you mind stepping aside for just a moment?" she asked, pointing to a spot near a tall glass sculpture. Langston moved without protest, but his jaw tightened slightly. He stood in that spot for nearly 5 minutes as guests streamed past, each one greeted with warmth, ushered in with quiet laughter and champagne flutes. Then the staffer returned, this time with a scanner in hand. He didn't ask Langston for his name. He simply lifted the device, angled it toward Langston's face, and scanned. The red beam flickered once over his cheek. Then the screen blinked. The man's mouth tightened. He looked up and nodded toward the doors, not the entrance, but the side exit. No words, just the gesture. Langston didn't move. "Excuse me," he said. "Is there a problem?" The man's voice was flat, almost apologetic. "I'm afraid your name doesn't appear on the guest registry." Langston held up the invitation. "I received this 4 weeks ago." The man nodded. "I understand, but it seems your access has been revoked." He offered no reason. None was required. His tone was final. Langston stood still as a waiter passed him with a tray of glasses, each one glittering under the chandeliers inside. The music beyond the door was soft, elegant, barely audible. Langston stepped back, folding the invitation slowly and sliding it into his coat pocket. Then he walked out back into the cold. The snow had begun falling again in faint, delicate flecks. Behind the building, along the alley that ran past the service entrance, Langston lit a cigarette he didn't intend to smoke, just holding it between his fingers as he paced. Something itched in the back of his mind. Not anger, not even frustration, just confirmation. This was no longer about oversight or error. This was strategy. This was design. As he passed the loading dock, a maintenance door creaked open and a staff member emerged, clipboard in hand, flipping through sheets. Langston, in passing, glanced down at the top page. His body stopped before his mind told it to. There, printed on the sheet, under a heading marked Restricted Access, was a photo of him. A candid shot, cropped from what looked like internal surveillance. His name, date of birth, affiliation, Merriweather Holdings, LLC. Status, denied. The employee looked up, startled, and quickly flipped the clipboard closed, mumbling something about deliveries as he disappeared into the service hallway. Langston stood alone in the alley, snow dusting his shoulders, the red ember of his cigarette dying without ever touching his lips. They had made it official. Not just a quiet blacklist, not just invisible hands rerouting his applications. They had codified him. He was now policy, a risk, a problem. A threat, perhaps not to the bank's financial core, but to its illusion of control. He didn't return home immediately. Instead, he walked the long way back through the city, down avenues lit by holiday garlands and shop windows. His reflection trailed him in the glass of parked cars and storefronts. He stopped once near a boutique coffee shop and stared into the pale shimmer of his own face, asking nothing, waiting for no reply. He was tired, not from the walking, from the watching, from seeing the truth so clearly only to be told, over and over, that it wasn't real. The mask eastward wore had finally slipped. It hadn't fallen off. It had been lowered slowly, deliberately, for him alone to see. Langston arrived home just after midnight. The invitation still rested in his coat pocket, damp from his hand. He pulled it out, set it on the table, and sat beside it. He didn't cry. He didn't rage. He simply sat, let the quiet wrap around him like a cocoon. The house was still, the lights low, the city muffled by snow and distance. He leaned back in his chair and let one thought rise to the surface of his mind like a diver breaking water. They're afraid. That's why. They know what I could become. That's why. He replayed it over and over again in his mind. The scan at the door, the silence of the hostess, the slow and calculated escort toward the side exit. They didn't need to say he was denied. They let procedure speak. They let systems hum with the force of quiet prejudice. There were no sirens, no public refusals, no scenes. Only the same pattern he now saw in everything eastward touched. A shadow process. A gate disguised as protocol. It was no longer just about his startup. It was about every door that was quietly closed, every smile that curved only as long as it had to, every screen that blinked red behind a clerk's polite expression. But Langston wasn't finished. That night, he opened his spreadsheet, pulled up his latest personal assets, ran the numbers again, and decided he was done waiting for doors to open. It was time to build something of his own. A space, a headquarters, a foothold. The Eastward flagship branch had always flaunted their community lending programs. They advertised access to capital for minority-owned enterprises, even hosted workshops about empowerment through real estate equity. Langston had watched their CEO boast on a local news special about helping underrepresented clients transition from renting to owning. He thought, let's see if that's true. Let's see what happens when the process has to meet me face to face. By Thursday morning, he had made his appointment at the lending office on the west side of the city. Unlike the gleaming downtown high-rise, this branch was modest. Faux wood floors, motivational posters on the walls, and a community bulletin board near the front. Langston entered with a folder in hand, credit reports, proof of income, property comps, licensing documents, all meticulously arranged. He wore the same gray suit from the gala, not out of protest, but out of principle. The receptionist greeted him without hesitation and pointed him toward an office marked Senior Loan Officer Delaney. Inside, a young woman with a blonde ponytail and a bright coral blazer stood up, hand extended. Her smile was practiced, warm, corporate. She invited him to sit, asked for his ID, and tapped at her keyboard. Her tone was courteous as he explained the nature of his business, the size of the property he intended to purchase, the budget, the square footage, and the renovations required. She nodded, said it was all very promising, and began typing more rapidly. Langston watched the way her smile grew tighter with each keystroke. She told him it would take just a few minutes to generate the pre-approval estimate. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She clicked a few tabs, then paused. She clicked again. Then her smile broke. "That's strange," she said, not quite looking at him. "The system seems to have reset." Langston frowned. "Reset?" She shrugged. "It's not pulling your application data. Might just be a glitch. I'll try again." She restarted the program. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Then she looked up with an expression Langston had now memorized. The one people wore when the machine had already made the decision they didn't want to say aloud. "We're having some back-end issues today," she explained, using words that meant nothing. "Would you mind leaving these documents with me? I'll have to circle back once the portal is running properly." Langston asked her if she had seen his name in the system at all. She hesitated, said briefly yes. He asked if it had pulled up a warning. She didn't answer. She said she would be in touch. Langston stood slowly, reached for the folder, and tucked it back under his arm. "I'd rather hold on to these," he said. She didn't stop him, didn't offer a timeline. He left the office with the weight of inevitability pressing down on his shoulders. Instead, he lingered outside the building, leaning casually against a nearby bench. He watched as clients entered and exited, as sunlight drifted through the tinted windows, as hours slipped past. At exactly 3:46 p.m., he saw something that made the pit of his stomach turn. A tall man with bright white teeth, khakis, and a Lacoste polo stepped out of the same door Langston had entered 3 hours earlier. In his hand was a small, cellophane-wrapped gift basket tied with a red ribbon. The man was smiling, laughing into his phone. He held a loan packet under one arm. Langston could make out the Eastward logo stamped along the corner. The man had been approved. He had been congratulated. He had been celebrated. Langston watched him stroll to a Lexus parked at the curb. The man opened the door, tossed the basket into the passenger seat, and drove away. Langston stepped back into the bank and crossed toward the reception desk. "Is Ms. Delaney still available?" he asked. The receptionist glanced at her clock. "Actually, the branch is closing early today," she replied with a cheery smile. "Team golf outing." Langston thanked her and walked out. He didn't speak, didn't show any sign of the hurricane brewing inside him. He walked until he found a place where the storm could release. That night, at a dim bar nestled near a strip of downtown office buildings, Langston found himself seated 2 stools down from a table of Eastward employees. He recognized one of them, a man he'd seen in the corridor the day of his application. They didn't notice him. They were already halfway through their drinks, laughing too loudly, their blazers folded over the backs of their chairs, their conversations easy and confident. Langston didn't try to eavesdrop. He didn't have to. One of them, tall, slouched, a loosened tie hanging like a surrender flag, raised his hands and began mimicking a voice, pitching it slightly higher and stretching out the vowels. "Good afternoon, I'm Langston Merriweather," he said in a faux formal tone, "and I've got a business proposal that's going to change the world." Laughter erupted. Another clapped, adding, "Don't forget the part where he brings a whole damn binder of graphs and expects someone to care." A third one lifted his glass and said, "The only thing Eastward needs from him is a broom in his hand." They all roared. One repeated the line, "A broom in his hand." Langston sat still. No anger, no reaction, only that deep, cold confirmation again, this time delivered with beer breath and laughter. He let them have their moment. Let them believe they'd reduced him to a punchline. The nights blurred into days, and meals became suggestions he rarely followed. He moved through his apartment like a man haunted by silence, and every quiet space became a forge where anger was hammered into discipline. The mocking voices from the bar echoed in his head not as pain, but as fuel. The vision of his face, printed beneath restricted access, returned to him in dreams. Only now the image came with clarity, with a purpose he no longer questioned. The red flag in Eastward's system was not just a marker of rejection. It was proof of exactly where to aim. There would be no protest, no social media posts, no demand for apologies. Langston had stopped asking long ago. This time, he would take. The Global Future Finance Summit was the largest fintech gathering in the country. Held annually in a sleek, glass-walled conference center that hovered above the skyline of Chicago, it attracted the brightest minds and boldest firms in financial technology, asset management, and banking innovation. Invitations were not requested. They were earned. Panels were filled months in advance. Sponsorships ran in the 7 figures. Langston's name had appeared on the final keynote slot only 3 days before the event began, causing confusion among registrants who weren't familiar with Merriweather Holdings. But those who followed the more aggressive trends in the startup sector, those who monitored disruption patterns in legacy financial systems, they knew who he was. They'd heard rumors. They had seen the clean, quietly published white papers. They had followed the exponential but shadowed growth of a company that had never played for visibility, but had somehow grown beyond the point of being ignored. Langston arrived at the venue just before dusk, dressed in a black three-piece suit tailored with precise aggression. His shoes struck the granite floors of the foyer with a pace that mirrored his heartbeat. Steady, unhurried, focused. In his hand, he carried a single leather folio. No laptop, no phone, no assistant. Clipped to his cuff was a family heirloom, a brass pocket watch that had belonged to his grandfather. It did not tick. It hadn't for years. But Langston carried it as a reminder of a man who had once shined shoes on the steps of buildings that now held his grandson's name in their investment reports. Backstage, a young woman with a clipboard and headset tried to brief him on the timing, but Langston simply nodded, eyes never leaving the edge of the curtain. Through the slit, he saw the hall filling, hundreds of attendees now seated, executives, journalists, analysts, bank officials, some from Eastward, especially from Eastward. He recognized 3 from the private wealth division, seated near the center. They hadn't noticed him yet. When the announcer stepped onto the platform and introduced the final speaker, there was no applause, just murmurs. Langston Merriweather, founder and executive chairman of Merriweather Holdings, fintech strategist, silent investor in over 9 financial infrastructure firms, builder of the Bridge model, an AI-based decentralized platform quietly being integrated into 3 of the nation's top 5 banks. The name meant little to many, but as he stepped into the light, the stir began. He didn't pause. He didn't adjust the mic. He didn't look to the screen behind him where his title and credentials were projected in bold type. He simply opened the folio and spoke. His voice was low and surgical, sharp with clarity, but calm in delivery. He walked them through the model. Not the one they expected, a pitch, a sales deck, a funding plea, but something else. A declaration, a roadmap, a surgical deconstruction of everything Eastward National claimed to offer and how its systems, policies, and practices were engineered to exclude while pretending to include. Langston presented hard data, integration logs, AI flagging patterns, system rules buried behind legal screens and customer disclaimers. He had copies of access tags, internal ones, used to categorize clients by perceived reputation and compliance. He showed the audience how restricted didn't mean criminal. It didn't even mean risky. It meant unprofitable to their image. It meant non-compliant to their culture. And then he revealed what no one expected. Langston, in partnership with a series of silent investors, including 2 members of the former Eastward National Advisory Board, had not only documented Eastward's systemic practices, he had spent the last year acquiring minority shares in every one of its external digital vendors. Every third-party contract that handled their data, their client insights, their AI protocols, was now answerable to a different authority, his. He paused only once during the entire 40-minute keynote. It came at the 30-minute mark, just after unveiling a motion to the Federal Banking Commission filed that morning. A motion to investigate Eastward's private wealth division for violations of the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, data manipulation during client onboarding, and failure to disclose internal flagging policies to regulatory auditors. He looked out at the crowd. Some had frozen. Others whispered. One executive's face turned a shade paler. Langston didn't flinch. He continued with the final slide. It displayed a single sentence. The Bridge model is now closed to Eastward National and its affiliates. There was no anger in his voice, only consequence. Effective immediately, he added. All algorithmic licenses currently in use by Eastward for client behavior analysis will be revoked. They no longer have access to the tools they used to mislabel and exclude. The room held its breath. Langston closed the folio. This is not personal, he said, though everyone knew it was. This is policy. Just like they wrote it. He left the stage not to applause, but to silence. The kind that follows impact. The kind that lingers when truth can no longer be dismissed. As he stepped backstage, a woman from the organizing committee stammered, "Mr. Merriweather, that was." He raised a hand gently. "They'll understand it in the morning." In the hallway, a junior reporter from a small financial blog stopped him. "Do you think Eastwood will respond?" she asked. Langston paused, then said with quiet finality, "They already have. Every time they said nothing. Every time they said no. That was their response. This is mine." Langston Merriweather stepped off the stage to the kind of silence that was louder than any applause, a silence thick with the tension of executives checking their phones under the table, of lawyers whispering to general counsels, of PR teams pinging damage control directives into internal Slack channels, as fire alarms of consequence began to blink red across Eastwood's digital infrastructure. The summit's closing hour dissolved not into celebration, but into containment, not into innovation pitches or networking cocktails, but into a frantic recalibration of power that had just shifted before their eyes, and Langston, already 2 steps ahead, walked through the hallway with the grace of someone who had not only survived rejection but weaponized it. That night, he didn't return to his apartment. He returned to the office, the real one, not the small co-working space where he once typed alone with headphones in and the buzz of vending machines nearby, but the glass-paneled suite on the 30th floor of a boutique tower, now branded in his company's new colors, the name Merriweather Holdings freshly stenciled onto the wall in minimalist lettering. It had been kept off the books until now, the final piece in a long game only a few had been aware of. He stepped into the boardroom, where his team, half a dozen executives, most from underrepresented backgrounds, all handpicked for their silence, resilience, and brilliance, stood waiting. They had watched the keynote. They had seen it coming. And now, it was time for the next strike. "Launch the exit," he said simply, setting his folio on the table. They didn't ask what he meant. They had prepared for this moment for 6 months. That night, a series of encrypted communications were released to financial custodians, wealth management liaisons, and compliance officers across the U.S., each containing authorization codes, liquid asset transfer instructions, and execution triggers, all tied to accounts managed by shell firms, holding vehicles, and investment partnerships connected to Merriweather Holdings. Over the last 10 years, Langston had built not just a startup, not just a platform, but an ecosystem of investment vehicles embedded deeply into the portfolios of institutions like Eastwood. What had once been fragments of community-driven financial capital, slowly, carefully, and legally, had been consolidated into scalable wealth flows that now resided in his control. By dawn, $2.4 billion had moved. The withdrawals weren't dramatic in isolation. Each came from a different angle. Retail accounts here, fund reallocations there, low-profile holdings that slipped under algorithmic review thresholds. But by the time Eastwood's Treasury dashboard refreshed at 8:06 a.m., the bleed was unmistakable. 2% of their liquidity buffer had vanished. Cross-department alerts began pinging. By 9 a.m., the CFO called an emergency meeting. By 10:30 a.m., a memo had reached the boardroom. Outflows detected. Exposure tied to vendor-linked investment portfolios. Further analysis ongoing. Langston, in a separate location, sat watching the data trail in real time, a dashboard of his own now mapped with Eastwood's internal failings, displayed in red, green, and white as each triggered action initiated its ripple. He made no calls. He offered no statements. The only communication from Merriweather Holdings that morning was a public release, a single-page letter published in the Financial Standard, the New York Ledger, and 5 top-tier financial blogs. The letter was signed only by Langston, dated precisely at 7 a.m., and it read, "To whom it may concern, effective immediately, all capital managed by Merriweather Holdings and its private subsidiaries has been withdrawn from Eastwood National Bank and its affiliated entities. This strategic reallocation reflects a commitment to transparency, ethics, and structural equity in financial services. We recognize institutions not by their promises, but by their practices. For a decade, we invested in silence. As of today, we invest in accountability." That was it. No slander, no names, just a retraction of faith from a man they thought would never be heard. But it didn't stop there. At 11:15 a.m., Eastwood's technology team encountered a second problem. Their security monitoring system, long the pride of their operational resilience protocols, began experiencing cascading failures in its user behavior analytics module. The AI that tracked fraudulent activity, logged anomalous transaction patterns, and managed internal compliance alerts began returning zero activity reports, flatline indicators across high-traffic data points. Confused, the lead developer attempted a diagnostic refresh. The system returned a license expiration error. He checked again, then a third time. He escalated. 42 minutes later, a memo landed on the CIO's desk. System failure. AI Behavior Intelligence Module. License revoked. It had not been a malfunction. It was intentional. Langston had designed the behavior AI early in his career, before Merriweather Holdings had a name, back when he freelanced code for startups and pitched models that large firms adopted without public credit. Eastward's system had been purchased under license through a vendor they no longer controlled. One Langston had quietly bought out 18 months ago. The license had been auto-renewing. Until now. It expired on March 6th. Langston had set it to lapse that morning. Within an hour, Eastward lost the last self-built component of its infrastructure. Their fraud detection, behavior modeling, and internal auditing systems went dark. An emergency IT patch restored only partial functionality. Transactions had to be monitored manually. Their response time dropped by 90%. Risk exposure ballooned. For a company with a reputation of seamless elite service, this was more than an embarrassment. It was a public vulnerability. At 2:30 p.m., a reporter from a mid-sized financial publication published a piece titled Exit Strategy. $2.4 billion leaves Eastward Bank in quiet coup. By 5 p.m., the article had been picked up by two major outlets. Market watchers began to ask questions. Shareholders started calling. A television segment aired on the evening Financial Digest. Who was Langston Merriweather? Inside the bank's headquarters, panic settled into form. Senior staff whispered in closed offices. A vice president requested leave. A junior analyst leaked part of the security error log to a journalist. The PR team scrambled to draft statements. Compliance prepared disclosures. And in the middle of it all, Langston sat alone in a quiet suite atop a building 3 blocks away, the skyline blazing outside the window, the city humming beneath him, and the weight he had carried for a year, longer, really, now shifting from his shoulders to theirs. He closed his laptop, poured a drink, and watched the sky turn from blue to gold to a deep earned black. They had erased him. They had humiliated him. They had marked his name with red flags and whispered judgments and locked doors. And now they would feel the absence of what they so confidently dismissed. They had underestimated the man who watched, the man who remembered, the man who rebuilt every wall they tried to close him out of. And now, in every digital corridor they once walked alone, they would see the shadow of the name they tried to erase. The receptionist had already received more than 30 calls from journalists, clients, and private investors before 9 a.m. The inbox of the bank's media relations team overflowed with urgent inquiries, many carrying subject lines with Langston's name. The boardroom, situated on the 40th floor with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the skyline, was occupied by a half-circle of executives who no longer knew how to breathe comfortably. The CEO, Jonathan R. Elbridge, a man who had once stood before televised panels talking about legacy, leadership, and inclusive growth, now sat with his elbows on the table, his fingers laced together in a tense pyramid beneath his nose. He hadn't said a word since entering. The chairman had already placed a file on the table. Inside was the motion to remove Elbridge from his role. It was not open for debate. At 10:32 a.m., the CFO followed with his resignation in a memo that included a 3-sentence apology and the word blind spot twice. Langston's actions the previous day had not only exposed systemic rot, but had detonated a long-suppressed tension inside Eastward. Employees who had once laughed in corridors now looked over their shoulders. Department heads scrambled to isolate their name from decisions made over the past decade. Old emails were deleted. Private chats wiped. Internal compliance teams began running diagnostics, not for external regulation, but for internal damage control. The breach wasn't financial anymore. It was moral. It was public. It was irreversible. Somewhere on the third floor, an intern named Kyle stumbled across an old composite frame mounted outside the Human Resources Archive. It held the original charter of Eastward Bank, a sepia-tone collage of photographs from the 1960s. Founding members, early branches, community outreach efforts. Behind the glare of the frame's glass, tucked partially behind a corner, was a faded picture of a smiling boy in a pressed shirt and bow tie, holding a balloon outside one of the earliest Eastward branches. A post-it note on the back identified him: Langston Merriweather, Summer Reading Award Ceremony, South Baton Rouge Branch. No one remembered who had placed it there. It had been forgotten, but not by him. Outside, chaos leaked into the city. News vans appeared. Social feeds exploded. Headlines shifted hourly. Digital coup shakes eastward, the billion-dollar exit, justice or vengeance. Langston's name trended. Analysts speculated about lawsuits, about SEC reviews, about federal investigations. Anonymous tips began surfacing, former employees offering glimpses into the culture, the exclusions, the internal tags, the unwritten rules. By noon, at least 10 mid-level staffers had submitted their resignations. More were pending. The guards who had ejected Langston months earlier, without cause, without hesitation, found themselves abruptly reassigned. One received a call that morning from HR advising his contract would not be renewed. Another, older, with 2 children and a car loan he had been deferring, stood outside the HR office, holding a box of belongings and staring at the ground. By evening, he was seen handing out resumes at a grocery chain 5 miles away. The man once known for his smug indifference, as he mocked Langston's credentials, now wore the thin, broken face of someone realizing the institution he defended had left him behind the moment it came under fire. In the executive lounge, the manager who had sipped espresso while Langston bled outside the lobby was caught in the parking garage arguing with a potential buyer over the price of his leased Audi. "It's got less than 40,000 miles, he said, voice strained, face flushed. "I can't go any lower." The buyer, unconvinced, walked away. The manager stood alone, holding the keys, no longer sipping anything. Internally, the collapse accelerated. The legal department worked overtime, redacting language from past policies. Communications drafted messages in frantic cycles, each press release worse than the last. The bank's core product, its elite image, had been publicly stripped of its mask. What remained wasn't just flawed, it was diseased. Meanwhile, Langston Merriweather sat not in a corner office, not before cameras, but in a small meeting room in a secondary building downtown, surrounded by a new team. Lawyers, data scientists, equity officers, and former employees of Eastward who had contacted him privately after the keynote. Some had been terminated quietly after raising concerns about discrimination. Others had left voluntarily, unable to stomach the environment. Now, they returned with purpose. Langston didn't raise his voice. He didn't smile. He simply laid out the next moves. There would be no revenge tour. There would be rebuilding. They would design a financial platform that learned from Eastward sins and erased them through function, not slogans. They would rewrite the code of institutional trust, starting with visibility, then access, then power. That evening, the sun dipped below the skyline, casting long shadows across the financial district. The lights inside Eastward's tower remained dim. Security huddled near the entrance, reporters stationed outside, former clients lining up for account closures. Inside the building, someone walked past the HR corridor and paused in front of the old photograph, still hanging behind the glass. Langston Merriweather stood just inside the community center's multipurpose hall, watching rows of folding tables being stacked by volunteers in matching vests. The space smelled faintly of sanitizer, roasted vegetables, and fresh linens. It was late afternoon, and the warm golden slant of the sun spilled through high windows and painted the room in hues of soft amber. It had been 3 months since Eastward National Bank collapsed beneath the weight of its own arrogance. 3 months since the CEO stepped down, since the executive floors emptied out, and since Langston's name became synonymous with one of the most strategic takedowns of institutional gatekeeping in modern finance. And yet, he was not here to talk about any of that. He wasn't here to speak, to be recognized, or to be congratulated. He was here, as he had been each month, with a modest delivery of refurbished laptops, grant paperwork for displaced workers, and printed packets of opportunity. Not handouts, bridges. Not rescue, restoration. He had walked through too many rooms that tried to erase him to believe in silence now. But he had also seen what happened when fury was left unshaped. It became noise. Langston believed in structure. And more than that, he believed in repair. As he walked past the tables, a man in a gray work vest glanced up from a folding chair and froze. For a long beat, he said nothing. His mouth parted slightly. His hands dropped the white cloth he'd been using. Langston stopped, recognizing the face immediately. A little thinner now, less self-assured. But it was him, one of the guards from that day outside Eastward's Velvet Rope Lounge, the man who had emptied Langston's satchel and stood silent as pages danced into the gutter. The man stood slowly, clearing his throat, his eyes never fully lifting. "Mr. Merriweather," he said, voice hoarse. Langston nodded. No fury, no contempt, just recognition. The man took a breath and said, "I didn't know. I didn't even ask. I just did what I was told." Langston studied him. The apology wasn't elaborate. It wasn't rehearsed, but it was real. The man added, "That day, I looked at you, and I didn't see anything but what they told me to expect. That's on me." Langston didn't smile, but he didn't walk away either. He reached into the side pocket of his coat and withdrew a manila folder. He held it out. "What's this?" the man asked. "Application packet," Langston said simply. "Recommendation letters already signed." The man stared at it for a moment before reaching out, hands shaking slightly as he took it. His fingers curled around the folder like it might vanish if he didn't hold on tightly enough. Langston turned and walked toward the supply office without another word. The man stood frozen, the folder in his hands, not understanding why this had just happened. But he would, later, after he read the letter. That night, a group of men and women gathered on the steps of what used to be Eastward National Bank. The building had undergone months of transformation. New floors, new security, new operations, but most importantly, new ownership. It had not been sold off to another conglomerate or swallowed by another bank. It had been rebuilt from within, restructured by an independent trust, whose majority equity was owned by employees, community partners, and a rotating board of diverse stakeholders. Langston didn't sit on that board. He didn't want power. He had always wanted access. The ceremony was short, quiet, a few remarks, a few acknowledgments. No cameras, no press releases. Just those who had been denied for too long stepping forward to open a place that no longer pretended to welcome them. It actually did. The old brass plaque bearing Eastward National Bank had already been taken down weeks before. In its place, a new sign now rested against the wall, draped in black velvet. A young woman, formerly a teller whose promotion had been stalled 3 times, stepped forward and pulled the cloth away. The new name gleamed in polished steel, Equity First. Beneath it, etched in smaller font, the phrase, "Here, every seat is earned." Langston stood at the back of the crowd. No one pointed, no one turned, but a few heads nodded his way, not in recognition of fame, but of understanding, of gratitude, of shared ground. He stepped away before the applause began, slipping out onto the street as night settled fully over the city. As he walked, he passed a line of children exiting a late tutoring session. One of them, a boy maybe 11 or 12, bumped into him accidentally, looked up and said, "Sorry, sir." Langston smiled and said, "You're good." The boy paused, squinting. "Are you the guy from the bank thing?" Langston nodded once, gentle. "That's me." The boy grinned. "My uncle said you got everybody back." "Like really back?" Langston's smile stayed steady. "We're getting there," he said. "One step at a time." The boy nodded as if he understood. Maybe he didn't, but one day he would. Langston kept walking. The city different now. Not easier, not cleaner, but better, more aware. It wasn't perfect. No transformation ever was. But the weight he had carried, the silence, the dismissal, the humiliation, was now part of something built to outlive him. His name didn't have to be on the building. He didn't need a statue. He had walked through fire, carried his dignity when others tried to strip it, and returned with open hands. The system had taken years from him, but he'd taken a system and turned it into something new, from ashes to seed.